Leonardo DiCaprio.
Miss Anne Hathaway.
Meryl Streep, the Iron Lady.
Alan Arkin in Little Miss Sunshine.
Kevin Costner.
The King's Speech.
Birdman.
I'm Connor Old, and welcome to the first episode of Redoing the Oscars, a brand new series I'm going to be doing every single week, breaking down a different category for the Oscars and giving us an alternative winner. What happened if this person won? Does that make sense? Was that the correct pick? And ultimately trying to figure out if the Academy made the right decision, kind of rewriting history, doing some alternative history, just really giving us an excuse to talk about individual Oscars years that I'm passionate about, really categories that I'm passionate about, to talk about so many other great performances. Because whether you like it or not, when you win an Oscar, you are etched into history. People remember that performance because it is associated with an award. But we have all those other nominees, and so many times there's a lot of great performances every single year, and a lot of them that lose. And this series will ultimately be kind of rewarding some of those alternative picks, both people that were nominated and lost, and then also people that weren't nominated at the time, but maybe should have been. So this episode, I'm going to be talking about the Best Actor category in 2015. We're starting in the year 2015 just because I started my videos in 2016 with my Connors. So if you want to see my favorite performances of 2016 and onwards, we've been doing videos now for 10 years. So you can check those out of what my favorite performances were, at least at the time. They've changed a bit, of course, but for the most part, they're pretty similar. So we wanted to start in 2015 and go throughout the 2000s and 90s and 80s. Before next thing you know, we're going to be back in predicting the Oscars. But I think this is going to be a fun series, and hope you stick around. So the structure of these videos will maybe change over the course. We'll have to see how things develop. But I think I'm going to go about these episodes is kind of course, start with some backstory, some Oscars context, what 2015 the year was, or what 1989 the year was, and give some backstory of, this was the, Spotlight Oscars, and this is what this happened. We were going into this, and it was a tight race, or it wasn't a tight race, all that kind of a fun context. Then ultimately pick one performance that I think should have won the Oscar that was nominated instead of the eventual winner. And then also the next part of the video will be an alternative pick, someone who was not nominated for the Oscar, and maybe they should have been, and maybe they should have even won. Talk about that performance, and then at the end, try to figure out, did the Academy get it right? Was this right for the actor's legacy or the director's legacy, or is this a stain on the Oscars kind of career? Are they only remembered because they won the Oscar? Is that actor deserving? All that kind of fun stuff, and alternative rewriting of history. And I think we still see this every year. I think why it's going to be a fun series is that we talked about this last week with Timothée Chalamet. I'm very bullish on his chances, for example, of having a great career 20 years from now. So we're going to be 20 years from now looking back on it and thinking, why did he, lose for Marty Supreme? What were his realistic chances? In the same way we were doing for Leo for all these years, or Matt Damon, and this will be just kind of like a fun thought exercise of a series of what if this person win, or what happened, and kind of celebrate some of the undersung performances that didn't win Oscars. So with that out of the way, let's get into some of this backstory, this Oscars context. It's the year 2015. This was one of the first years I really got into the Oscars and really being passionate about the Best Picture winner, because it was genuinely a race. We like to say things like, could it be one ballot after another, or Sinners? It was probably going to be one ballot after another, and it ultimately was. But in this case, we have, Spotlight winning just the SAG-AFTRA's Best Ensemble, Big Short winning the Producers Guild Awards, and then Revenant winning DGA and BAFTA. I mean, we had a real, genuine three split race for Best Picture. And I think a lot of people going into the night were really interested in that race. The acting races, I remember at the time being surprised that Sylvester Stallone ultimately lost for Best Supporting Actor. Maybe we shouldn't have been, but ultimately, that was a surprise at the time. But the other three acting races, for the most part, were pretty locked up, pretty standard. I think we knew who was going to win. So aside from seeing who's going to win Best Picture, I think a lot of people were very interested to see, will Leo ultimately win his Oscar? It was, even at the time, back in 2015, a bit of a meme, a bit of a recurring thing on the internet, where it's like, why hasn't he won? He's been continually snubbed. He had been nominated 4 times before this. for acting, and he'd also been the lead star, even though he wasn't nominated, he was the lead star of 2 Best Picture winning movies in The Departed and Titanic. He was a definitive movie star, one of the best of his time, and continually puts out, great performances. So it was kind of odd that he didn't have an Oscar. So in the Oscars community, we can kind of say it was quote unquote his time. Not only was he connected to a very strong Best Picture potential movie and a movie that won multiple Oscars, but also was connected to this legacy of him being a great actor. So it had that kind of double narrative of being a well-liked movie for the year, while also having a strong narrative behind him. But was it the right pick? We'll go into that a little bit later. Now I want to crown my alternative nominated pick, that being Matt Damon for The Martian, as the title of the video suggests. What if Matt Damon won the Oscar here for 2015? And personally, of my favorites from this year, nominated or unnominated, I would go with Matt Damon. I do think he had the best performance of the year, because it's something that the Oscars would have never rewarded, but maybe frankly should, which is an ultimate movie star performance. I don't know if necessarily people are looking at Matt Damon in The Martian and going like, wow, what a transformative performance. I couldn't tell it was Matt Damon. It's the opposite. It's going, I like Matt Damon. I like being with him and hanging out with him. Let me spend 2 hours hanging out with him and him being smart and funny and charming. And for as much as that seems kind of simple, I think for the Oscars, even for someone like a DiCaprio or a Will Smith, they reward people not for their movie star personas, but sometimes when they tone that down or have to transform themselves to do something else. But when we think of these movie stars, we often think of them as their kind of movie star personas rather than their transformative acting Oscar bait type of roles. I do think it's still something that the Academy, despite their many changes, have not able to totally recognize. And if they were to give an Oscar this year, I think Damon for The Martian makes the most sense. You see the legacy of it very clearly. Just this past weekend, we had Ryan Gosling in Project Hail Mary, which was his version of The Martian. Him in space by himself, adapting a book of the author of The Martian with the screenwriter who also wrote The Martian. Like, it's very much Ryan Gosling going, where's my Martian? I want that. And I think there's a strong legacy to what Damon was able to bring to that kind of a role. And it's maybe easier than it seems, right? Just put a movie star in space and you got a huge hit. The fact of the matter is that in both Project Hail Mary and also in The Martian, in particular more so with The Martian, Matt Damon is just by himself. That's the plot of the movie. So he has to carry the entire movie on his shoulders. Yes, there is some communication in terms of him talking to himself through a vlog, and we get some of his thoughts and his reasonings that way. But there's a lot of moments of silence in which he is seen thinking and processing stuff. And I think it's a perfect vehicle for him because it combines the elements of natural charisma and just a likability to Damon. It combines the fact that he's seemingly like this kind of everyday kind of a guy, and the fact that he's one of the best actors at portraying intelligence or thinking that I think we've ever had. When you think about his most successful roles, many times it's Bourne, and he has to kind of think through a problem in real time, and he's processing things, or Good Will Hunting, in which he's very intelligent in some of those great scenes. Martian kind of combines all of that together, and I think it's a real testament to the fact that he's alone by himself. You're not watching anything else except for him, grow potatoes or solve some problems, and he's so winning and he's so charming. He's able to deliver that comedy, but then also even I think some of the emotional elements work as well. In terms of kind of the frustration that he has or the loneliness, it's all able to kind of be communicated through that. And maybe the reason why we haven't had a movie like The Martian since The Martian, now with Project Hail Mary, is because there's very few actors that could sustain a movie for 2 hours and have just being people enamored by themselves and being by themselves in space. So I think this would have been a great pick at the time. It would have been Matt Damon's second Oscar. I think a lot of people think of him as, he's already won an Oscar, right? Because he has that iconic speech. And yes, he does have an Oscar for writing Good Will Hunting, but he doesn't have one for acting. And I think this would have been an opportunity to give him his acting Oscar for being one of the most reliable movie stars of the past 25 years, someone that everyone really likes. The Martian is a movie that's still sustained in its legacy, I think. It was a popular hit at the time, but if you look at things like Letterboxd logs or IMDb, votes in terms of ratings, of the 10 Best Picture movies, it's second only to Mad Max Fury Road. Like, it has more watches and logs than Revenant or Spotlight or Room. It is a very popular movie still to this day. And I think if you were to reward anything from the film, got 7 Oscars, didn't end up getting anything. I do think Damon is the obvious pick there. Maybe not a transformative performance like the Oscars like to reward, but a movie star performance that I think should also be rewarded as well. It's Damon capturing that Damon persona like only literally he can, and I think it's a perfect kind of a marriage of material and actor, and it's one of my favorite movies of the decade, so I would have loved to see Matt Damon win the Oscar here. But now, speaking about maybe my alternative unnominated pick, so many years, we only have the 5 nominees, but many times the Oscars can't see, the long tail of what movies will actually resonate, and they don't nominate some of the people that maybe probably should have. So my choice for the alt unnominated pick would be Tom Cruise in Mission Impossible Rogue Nation. I think this is his definitive performance as Ethan Hunt. I think in his obituary, people will recognize him as the Mission Impossible guy. That was his franchise that he developed, the character he's played the most frequently. I'd say even more so than Maverick or Jerry Maguire. I think Ethan Hunt, for a lot of people, is Tom Cruise. And that's what he's going to be remembered by. And Tom Cruise doesn't have an Oscar. So why not give him an opportunity here to finally get one, and for his most iconic character? That's something as well that the Oscars haven't necessarily done. When you think of why doesn't Keanu Reeves have an Oscar for John Wick? And I'm being serious about this. Or, Daniel Radcliffe for Harry Potter. These are iconic characters that have been defined by individual actors over multiple films, and yet they haven't been kind of rewarded in that sense from the Oscars. It is something that I don't think people would be mad. Maybe I'm wrong, but I don't think people would be mad if, let's say, Daniel Radcliffe had an Oscar for one of the Harry Potter movies. Because guess what? That's a defining character for generations that spanned a whole bunch of movies and was a huge success. That should be, I think, a testament to that actor's ability to create and define a literal iconic role. Well, so you have the same thing here with Tom Cruise and Ethan Hunt, defining an iconic role. And I chose Rogue Nation here instead of maybe something like Fallout and Ghost Protocol because I do think it is the pinnacle of the Mission Impossible franchise, but also the pinnacle of his performance as Ethan Hunt. First off, you have the introduction of Rebecca Ferguson's Ilsa Faust, in which he has a kind of genuine, I think, mysterious but romantic relationship with a kind of classic femme fatale, but still romantic and caring. I do believe it in the film, which is kind of an oddity for Tom Cruise. He's not like a Ryan Gosling who has chemistry with every one of his co-stars. Tom Cruise is a little bit more hit or miss sometimes, so the fact that he is able to get a great romantic relationship there with Rebecca Ferguson elevates it from even something like Ghost Protocol, or I would say Fallout. And then I think he's able to strike the balance of still human while being legendary in this film. I think in the later films, particularly something like Fallout, he is kind of like this godlike figure who's unhuman in many ways, and they kind of lean into that factor. But in this movie, if you rewatch it, he's hanging off the side of a plane, but he's kind of failing and then ultimately succeeding. Or the underwater sequence in which he holds his breath for 4 minutes or so, but has to be saved by Ilsa Faust ultimately, that he doesn't succeed. Now he's able to still feel clever and cool, particularly by the ending of the film, that very satisfying ending of outwitting the villain. But for a lot of it, it's failing or someone that feels a little bit more human, trying and just barely getting by, rather than that kind of legendary godlike figure status that some of the later films kind of play him as. I do think it strikes a good balance of being someone that is able to still get the job done, but just barely, but just still a human behind things at the end of the day that is amazed sometimes by his own skill and ability, and has this kind of great combination of still old enough of knowing what his character is and defining that and really getting a true understanding of Ethan Hunt as the person, but then also being young enough that he can still do a lot of the stunts as well. So I think it's kind of this perfect marriage of Cruise at this time. And I think the fact that Cruise doesn't have an Oscar is kind of a shame. I think that this is his defining role for the 2010s and 2000s, right? And I think we're entering into a new phase of his career now that he's older and can't do as much of those stunts anymore. But still, this is a huge defining part of his career. And in the same way, I want to give Matt Damon an Oscar for his movie star performance in The Martian. Cruise, in another way, less maybe humorous, maybe a little bit more physical and stunt-driven, but is also a defining movie star performance in this film, and was so in many ways for the rest of the decade. So kind of a look back on it to go, if Tom Cruise won an Oscar for Ethan Hunt, I don't think people would be upset. I think they'd be glad that Cruise has an Oscar. and the fact that he got for his most iconic character would also make sense too. So who knows, maybe he will win one for Ethan Hunt in Mission Impossible 9 or 10, but I think for right now, if I were to redo the Oscars, looking back on it, I think Matt Damon's still my number one pick out of anybody from 2015. But if I were to pick someone that wasn't nominated at the Oscars, I think this is a great opportunity to give Cruise his Oscar. But then finally, did the Academy get it right? It ultimately went to DiCaprio in The Revenant, which is a movie I like and a performer I absolutely love. And did they get it right? I'm going to go with ultimately yes. I think it's maybe more of a kind of answer. I think in future episodes I'm going to be more definitive and say like, no, they didn't get it right. That's why I'm making the video. But in this case here, it's hard for me because I think on one hand, two things can be true. On one hand, I think everyone's glad that Leo has an Oscar and that if he didn't win for The Revenant and it went to Matt Damon at the time, he would have eventually won for Once Upon a Time in Hollywood or Don't Look Up. He would have gotten it eventually just because it would have gotten so big of a thing that DiCaprio still didn't have his Oscar. And yeah, I think also a lot of people can realize that it's probably not a top 5 performance from him. That Inarritu, I think, at least amongst online film people, he's a little bit more of a controversial filmmaker in that he's not like a Scorsese or Paul Thomas Anderson, this super revered, hallowed figure that everyone really respects. He's got, some misses for as many hits as he does have. So it's not the movie that he should have won for, but I'm still really glad that he did win a movie. I think both can kind of be true. So did they get it right? Yes, because they gave Leo an Oscar kind of a little bit too late, but I don't think it's as, egregious as, let's say, oh, we did give Al Pacino an Oscar for Godfather, so we had to give one for something like Scent of a Woman. It's more, closer to his best performances, even though I don't think amongst Leo fans, many people would say it's a top 5 performance. It's a solid performance in a solid movie, but maybe not his best. But hey, that's the Oscars. That's why we're redoing the Oscars to try to rewrite history. And who knows? I'm taking away an Oscar from Leo today, but maybe I'm going to give him another one earlier in a few weeks, let's say. I guess you'll have to figure that out and stay tuned until that happens. But that's it. That's the first episode here of redoing the Oscars. Next week will be 2014. I'm not going to be doing Best Actor. I'm going to be doing another Oscars category, but you can subscribe to the channel so you can eventually check what that out is. We're going to be talking about Best Picture redoing, Best Actor, Actress, Director, all the kind of main top line categories. So I hope you stay tuned and come along for the ride with that. And I hope you enjoyed this first inaugural episode. But that's about it. Until next time, stay tuned.